Mark Bray is a lecturer at Dartmouth College. He received his PhD in modern European history at Rutgers University in 2016. His work has appeared in Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, and Boston Review. He is a political organizer who's been involved in global justice movements, including the anti-war movements and immigration rights. He was an organizer of Occupy Wall Street in 2011 and subsequently wrote a book about that experience, translating the anarchists of Occupy Wall Street. Last August, after an outbreak of violence at a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, when a right-wing sympathizer drove his car into counter-protesters, killing one, he published an analysis piece in the Washington Post. He described a group of protesters present there called Antifa as a movement with leftist politics applied to fighting the far right, quote, whose members, quote, organize educational campaigns, monitor fascists, and physically confront the far right when necessary, quote. Subsequently, he appeared on Meet the Press to discuss whether movements like Antifa may be justified in using violence to counter right-wing extremist groups. He said that, quote, when pushed, self-defense is a legitimate response to white supremacist and neo-Nazi violence. We've tried ignoring neo-Nazis in the past. We've seen how that turned out in the 20s and 30s. Quote. In response, the president of Dartmouth College issued a statement saying that, quote, recent statements made by lecturer Mark Bray supporting violent protests do not represent the values of Dartmouth. Quote, 100 Dartmouth faculty members signed a letter addressed to the president criticizing this statement. Last year, Mark published Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, which explores the rise of fascism and the history of the anti-fascist movement.
Can everyone hear me? All right, if you can, just give me a little heads up because I want everyone to hear. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for having me at BOOKSTOCK. As you mentioned, I was one of the organizers of Occupy Wall Street in New York City in 2011. And in some ways, it feels like a very different political time thinking back to 2011 in a variety of ways, which we can all think of. But I remember sitting in Zuccotti Park in New York as thousands and thousands of people milled around, being thankful that, for example, no one opened fire on us when we were sitting in Zuccotti Park. And unfortunately, in the United States, that is a consideration with every large crowd, lamentably. I never worried, though, about something that you have to worry about as a leftist in most countries around the world, which is far-right thugs coming to attack your leftist demonstration. Never worried about it. It never happened, to my knowledge, in Occupy Wall Street. It's starting to happen now. So this morning, for example, a group of Patriot Front attacked an Occupy ICE encampment in Texas. In Oregon, there have been threats from local far-right groups. There have been book fairs that have been interrupted, anti-racist trainings. I saw something from a candidate running for Senate in Tennessee who's having members of the National Socialist Movement threaten his campaign. Now, on a national scale, this is still small potatoes. Right, but the fact that it's even a conversation at all means that it's a conversation, and as the history of this kind of threat shows, if you don't take it seriously in whatever way you think that it ought to be taken seriously, when it's small, you run the risk of it growing and becoming too little too late. So in that context, I wrote the book Antifa to talk about the history of the anti-fascist movement. And so what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about what is anti-fascism, what is specifically Antifa, where did that term come from, what does it mean, and how has it played out in American politics recently. And then I'm going to make sure to leave time for questions because I'm sure that people have questions and strong opinions about this topic because this topic elicits strong opinions as it should. So Anti-fascism, in a certain sense, seems like a very obvious notion, being against fascism, and it is. But my book focuses on one specific tradition within the history of anti-fascism that has come to be called militant anti-fascism in English and Italian, is often called autonomous anti-fascism in German, radical anti-fascism in France. This tendency really crystallized in the period after World War II, because in a certain sense, many of us know the basic story of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. That in countries like Germany and Italy, there were strong anti-fascist movements of all the different leftist parties and unions and democratic factions to push back against the Nazis and the fascists. Unfortunately, they didn't succeed in most cases, although there were some guerrilla partisan movements in the 40s that had a lot of success in different parts of Europe. But usually that's the end of the story, right? Usually that's when people think that the Axis powers were definitively defeated, nothing more to see there. Sure, they were defeated, but there were still people that agreed with Hitler, that agreed with Mussolini all around Europe. And so the question for the European left became what to do about this to make sure this doesn't happen again. And there were two main opinions that kind of emerged. The one opinion for many continental socialist and communist parties was to make it illegal to form another Nazi or fascist party. To simply make it illegal. Use the state and legislation to legislate against the far right. And there are a lot of countries in Europe that have those kinds of laws. What ends up happening, right? Well, the far right changes the symbols. Instead of using swastikas, they'll use iron crosses. Instead of calling themselves Nazis, instead of talking explicitly always about white supremacy, they'll start talking about white nationalism. They'll start looking to the movements of anti-colonialism, movements of people of color, and say, okay, if there can be black power, why not white power? If there can be national liberation in South Africa, why not a white liberation in Europe? And so they start to sort of co-opt some of the language of the left, change the symbols, change the names, and basically try to present white supremacy as just one interest group among many. And that's one of the confusions. That's where you get the notion of white nationalism, because the political capital of fascism and Nazism were mostly out the window. In response to this, a movement develops that is the focus of my book, militant anti-fascism, which I think can be really summed up in two main things. The first is it is a politics and strategy of direct action against the far right. It does not trust in the state or the courts or the police to always stop the far right. Do they sometimes stop the far right? Sure. Do they always? I think not. So, I mean, in the United States, if you look at the documented infiltration of local law enforcement by white supremacist groups investigated by the FBI in the 90s, or even if you look at video of Charlottesville, you can see the local law enforcement treating the white supremacists in a way that they would never treat a Black Lives Matter group. So they argue for direct action. Direct action can mean a wide variety of things. I think there's this misconception that direct action has to mean confrontation, but it really means problem solving without intermediaries. Direct action is problem solving without intermediaries. It's saying if you want a community garden built in your neighborhood, and the town's not doing it, maybe you occupy the land and build a garden. In the context of confronting the far right, it means if the police and the state are allowing the far right to amass, you show up and make it so that they can't be heard. Anti-fascists do this in a wide variety of ways, with noise protests, with megaphones, with puppet shows, and sometimes by physically confronting and stopping the far right from having a demonstration. The other main component of militant anti-fascism is that it's a politics of sort of pan-radical left unity. Because one of the reasons why Hitler, Mussolini managed to gain power was because the left-wing movements of their countries were fragmented and were more focused on fighting each other than the common enemy. That really didn't start to change in a major way until the Spanish Civil War, but even then they had infighting. So militant anti-fascists argue that, okay, there's plenty of stuff that divides us, but let's try to put that aside for the time being to confront the far right. And so in the United States, this tradition really, in this sort of European-inspired variant, got going in the late 80s and 90s with Anti-Racist Action, which was a network of hundreds of groups around the country, very much connected to the punk movement, counterculture movements, that would go into high schools and talk to young people about the dangers of the far right, would tour with Warped Tour, Mighty Mighty Bosstones, have tables of information, and would at times confront the far right based on intensive monitoring. Because most of what these groups most of the time do is spend endless hours on the most reprehensible message boards, keeping an eye on what the far right are up to. And they're often much more well-informed than the mainstream media, unfortunately. If you look at Charlottesville, for example, last year, and you read a lot of the mainstream media, barely a blip until the day happens, until Heather Heyer's murder, but anti-fascists had been ringing the alarm bell well in advance. And that brings me to sort of the present day. The demonstration in Charlottesville was called Unite the Right. The idea was to try to unite the far-right factions that had over recent years been very scattered. And that included explicitly neo-Nazi groups. It included more vaguely fascist, what they call themselves sometimes as patriot groups. It included Proud Boys, which are basically Western chauvinist anti-feminists. It included a wide range of reprehensible actors who tried to get on the same page. And it failed. Since the demonstration didn't actually occur, the police canceled it before it could actually start. And subsequently, a lot of infighting occurred among the different factions. And really, over the past year or so, there's been a lot less noise from the far right than many people thought. But there are a couple of key dates coming up to really test whether that's going to continue to be the case. So if you're curious to see what the far right does, you can keep these in mind. August 4th in Portland, Oregon, there's going to be a demonstration of Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys. The Pacific Northwest has arguably been having the worst problem with this recently. So there's been calls by local anti-racists and anti-fascists in the Pacific Northwest to show up in the thousands to make sure that their voice isn't heard and that no one gets hurt. Because really, the cases of violence are usually the worst when the numbers are equal on both sides. So regardless of what you think about tactics, if you want a safe, effective, anti-racist, anti-fascist protest, everyone show up. That's what you see in Boston, for example, that happened. Another date to keep in mind is August 12th, when there is the Unite the Right 2. They're literally calling it Unite the Right 2. They didn't realize that sequels are always worse than the original, and this is a sequel no one asked for. They were denied a permit to have this in Charlottesville, so they're having it in Washington, D.C. So organizers in D.C., Virginia, North Carolina, et cetera, are again trying to bring everyone out to show that these groups aren't welcome in D.C. or anywhere else. So I think it's interesting moving forward. Keep an eye on how those days turn out. It'll give a good indication as to where this is going in a big picture sense. How am I doing on time? I can look at my own. I have a clock. All right, I'm doing good. All right, I'm going to say a few more things and then we'll open it up. A few misconceptions about what the media reports on this. Antifa is not one specific group. It's this kind of politics. The term Antifa comes out of efforts of European anti-fascists to have a common word to be able to talk about anti-fascism in multiple language, because antifascismo in Spanish, antifascismo in French, et cetera, all start with Antifa, and that's where the pronunciation comes from. It's not really a term that was used a lot among similar groups in the US until starting around 2007, in part because of the role of social media in spreading more knowledge of European movements to the US. In Britain, the groups are often called anti-fascist action. So it's not one specific group, it's a kind of politics. In a certain sense, I think you could think of it in terms of the word socialist or socialism. Socialism is not a group, but there can be socialist groups, right, that have slightly different politics. Antifa is not a group, there are Antifa groups that call themselves that. As I said, physical confrontation is actually a small percentage of what they do, but it gets a lot of media attention. If you're curious about the whole violence, nonviolence question, that's on the table, and you can zip that on over to me in a few minutes. And let's see, what else? Throw out Trump. People want to hear about Trump. Trump definitely inspired this rise of the alt-right. It's no secret. His dog whistles, or really often just whistles, have been a major focus. A lot of these groups prior to his election really just were scattered alone behind their computer screens and then felt enabled to come out into the public sphere. And his comments about beating up leftist protesters certainly create a kind of discourse that street-level fascists can take advantage of. But I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about fascism and anti-fascism, that these are variations of politics that go way back in American history. And so I always include a point made by Ami Césaire and other writers that to some extent we can think of Nazism and fascism as European imperialism and colonialism brought home to the European continent. And if we take that seriously and think of fascism as one variant of white supremacy and imperialism, I think so too we can think of anti-fascism as one variant of resistance to imperialism, colonialism, and genocide. And in that way, American history with the KKK, with other white supremacist groups, goes much farther back. And unfortunately, getting Trump out of office won't solve that problem, as I'm sure you all realize. And so I think it's important to recognize the danger that he poses, recognize what his presidency has meant for these groups, but also see this as an issue that will continue beyond him and an issue that extends beyond explicitly white supremacist groups. Because the danger these groups poses is not just about physical altercations, although they are very dangerous, but also about influencing popular discourses, about shifting the center of gravity on conversations around migration, affirmative action, reproductive rights, and so forth. One notable example that maybe some of you have heard of, maybe not, is the main document published on Breitbart, What is the Alt-Right, was penned by Milo Yiannopoulos back a couple of years ago, and a recent BuzzFeed, well, not that recent, 9 months ago, a recent article, we'll call it recent, published by BuzzFeed showed that Milo Yiannopoulos essentially crowdsourced the information from a group of neo-Nazis, put it together, sent it out there, it was read by millions of people and quoted by Donald Trump. And then, we can get into Stephen Miller and Bannon and Gorka and so forth. But what this shows, and really this has been true always, is that it's not just a question of who identifies with far-right politics. Because actually, when Mussolini took power, the fascist party was very tiny. He gained power through consolidating his hold over a coalition government. There weren't that many self-professed Nazis prior to Hitler's rise to power, but these kinds of politics can have a disproportionate impact on the center of gravity and can win over conservatives, business owners who feel threatened by workers' movements, can win them over, people who feel like their quote-unquote traditional ways of life are evaporating, can win them over to these kinds of politics. And so when we think of what anti-fascism is, it's important to think of organizing against the far right, but the more you kind of peel the layers of the onion back, the more you start to see that ultimately the goal has to be creating communities that are resistant to the appeals of fascism, so that when there's an economic downturn, people don't blame immigrants, they organize with their coworkers, because their ideas and arguments win out in times of crisis, and that's when our movements have to be strongest. Because these kinds of problems will keep flaring up as long as those issues remain unaddressed. So, I'm going to open up for questions, comments, and we're going to wrap up at 1:40, so that gives 20 minutes. That should be plenty of time. I'm going to go 1, 2, and then we'll take it from there. Yes?
Commenting on the president of Dartmouth Colleges.
Sure.
Could you explain that a little bit?
So I went on Meet the Press to talk about my book and anti-fascism a week after Charlottesville. And I made the case that the historical record shows that self-defense against fascist and far-right groups is sometimes lamentably necessary, and that kind of historically informed opinion informs my political argument that, as a last resort, self-defense against the far-right is necessary. That was picked up by essentially some student far-right papers, the sort of Breitbart for kids, who started reporting that. And what they would always do is, I would say anti-fascists argue, and they would quote me as Mark Bray argues, which is a bit different. That seemed to have generated some steam. And this is another example of the relationship between the super far-right media and centrist discourse. That was picked up by Breitbart, then it was picked up by Fox News, and then presumably some phone calls were made to the president of Dartmouth, right? So it's that chain. So he issued a statement without consulting me to get my opinion, essentially saying that I endorsed violent protest, which in my opinion is like saying a surgeon endorses cutting people. You know, like let's get some context. Let's talk about exactly what we're referring to. But in response to that, my coworkers at Dartmouth, actually the letter reached about 130, 140 signatures, said we support his academic freedom and he's making historically informed arguments that are within the bounds of legitimate academic discourse at the college. And President Hanlon issued a follow-up statement saying, oh, no, I was always in favor of his freedom of academic freedom. I wanted to clarify he did not speak officially in the name of the college, which to me is a disclaimer that no professor ever makes that, you know. So that worked out. I kept my job, and that's what happened. Yes?
So what to you equals the far right?
Good question. So I'm going to try to give some context, but not go on too long, which is a challenge for me sometimes. So again, if we're talking about fascism in the far right, back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, groups around Europe and elsewhere were very comfortable calling themselves fascists and Nazis. After World War II, this changed very dramatically in the ways that I alluded to earlier. So the challenge is, and this is an issue that's come up a lot, is if fascism is a discourse that even in its sort of traditional form is difficult to define and historians debate over what it means, some have broad definitions, some have narrow. And then after the war, a lot of fascists jettison a lot of ideas that defined fascists early on, adopt other kinds of ideas, then where do you quote unquote draw the line? I would define the far right more in a contextual sense of looking at lived examples in society. So for example, let's just go with today, right? So if you look at Europe, for example, you can see examples like Pegida or the Front National, which grew out of more explicitly fascist groups, but have sought to tap into widespread xenophobia and Islamophobia, especially in the case of Pegida, in order to sort of rebrand their politics in a kind of nationalist direction. So it's not like there's any sort of, beyond this point, you're not far right. I think it's contextual. You know, I mean, so it's, and again, I don't think it's an analytical question. I think it's a question to be defined by movements and communities that are under attack, because unfortunately, most of these politics really play out when Muslim neighborhoods are being attacked, when unions and their union halls are being busted up, when there are policies to put kids in concentration camps. Do you want to follow up? Go ahead.
So you're saying it's fluid?
Well, I mean, politics are always fluid. I mean, that is the reality of politics, and anyone who tells you otherwise is coming up with some political science mumbo jumbo, because that is the reality of politics, is that it's fluid. And that's what makes it hard. Politics are really hard, right? Where do you define the left? Where do you define the far left? Like, we could sit here for weeks and never come to consensus on that. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, though, right? Because the threat of the far right, the threat of Islamophobia, xenophobia, these are very real threats that break bones and kill people. And so that is the challenge. But the reality is it's not easy to define, and it's not easy to stop, and it's not easy to write about. It's not easy to talk about. I wish it were otherwise. Yes?
Being a graduate of Middlebury, I was surprised at the response to Murray's talk there a year ago now.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think Middlebury could have done more research and gotten the elements of Murray's argument that really don't hold much water.
Yeah.
But my feeling was that there was too much. Murray is a relatively quiet academic. I don't like his views, but you know, he's not a Yiannopoulos. But I had a feeling that the Antifa there were too aggressive on that,
sure.
And I think in that sense hurt their argument. But I want you probably obviously studied it. Your reaction to that,
sure.
To that incident.
Sure. Well, the first thing to clarify is that probably most of the people who were, so to clarify, people may not know what we're talking about. Charles Murray is a writer who wrote a known book basically arguing that there's a hierarchy of intelligences by race. That's been discredited. He gave a talk at Middlebury a year ago or so that was disrupted by people in attendance. There's a lot more to be said about that, but you can Google it. So first thing to clarify is that I would guess most, if not all, of the people that disrupted it weren't probably actually part of any Antifa group at all. They were probably mostly students and community members who disagreed with what he said. And so that's another thing that gets kind of confused in the news, is that the politics of no platform for fascism, which is this is sort of a variant of this perhaps, extend beyond people who are part of these groups. And so just to clarify that in terms of the terms being there. So sure, I think we agree that Middlebury shouldn't, or maybe it sounds like we agree Middlebury shouldn't have hosted him. Okay, sure, fine.
They didn't have that much warning. That was a problem.
Yeah. But I think it's important also so you raise the issue of sort of how loud he is compared to Milo Yiannopoulos, for example. And I think that it's can be a little bit deceptive to think simply in terms of sort of one's presentative form when we think of the influence of any kind of argument. If you look at the kinds of racial theories that were picked up by the Nazis, by people arguing for Jim Crow, they were often originally written by very straight-laced academic intellectual types who sat behind their desk, pontificated about the inferiority of black people or Jews or whoever, sent their writings off, and then they were picked up by other people. So I would encourage everyone to think in terms of the danger of these ideas, not just in terms of the sort of package they come in. So then the question exists. If you are a black or a Latino student at Middlebury and your school is hosting a talk by someone who argues that you are inherently biologically inferior, what do you do about it? We're not going to all agree about what to do about it, and that's part of the point. But I think especially, this is a predominantly white audience, and I think that identity matters. And I think we ought to also, as a white person myself, think about, is it the job of white people to tell people of color what to do about those who are promoting pseudo-scientific doctrines about their inferiority in a context when white supremacy is on the resurgence? I would argue against that. But I think that really the history of white supremacy is so destructive and murderous that I did not have a problem with disrupting Charles Murray's talk. That's just my opinion. Yeah.
So I was at Occupy Wall Street all the time. I was in New York. I was at the Black Lives Matter marches. And it wasn't until the folks at Charlottesville were saying that the police weren't protecting them, the Antifa were the ones who stepped in and created a barrier for their safety. Who are the Antifa? I mean, how did I admit someone who's been politically active in the heart of it? How come I never heard of it?
Well, I would encourage you to pick up this book. Who are these people? So the book is based on interviews with anti-fascists, over 60 anti-fascists from 17 different countries. So I do sort of get into that question. And they are union organizers and anti-gentrification organizers and anti-war folks and racial justice people and Black Lives Matter people who some of the times do that stuff and some of the times do other stuff. So for example, I talked to a group in Virginia that essentially has over the past 3 or 4 years split their time between organizing against a proposed oil pipeline construction and organizing against the far right, depending on which issue they thought was more of a concern. So in that sense, it is a cross-section of the kind of anti-capitalist left. People who are in circumstances where that seems like enough of a threat to organize against it. I've been involved in a number of movements. I have never lived somewhere where that seemed like an issue that was important enough for me in a local sense to get involved with, so I haven't done that kind of work. But if I had lived somewhere where my friends were getting beaten up at punk shows or where an anti-racist training was getting disrupted by a quote-unquote patriot group, maybe I would get involved with a group to try and organize against that. In general, it is people who take direct action politics seriously in one form or another and aren't content to rely on the state or the police to stop the far right. And so in that sense, in the United States, probably disproportionately anarchist in their political leanings. But in some countries or some cities that ranges. And that's partly why the symbol is often a red flag and a black flag, or a red flag and a Basque national flag or a Catalan national flag in the context of Europe, because it's trying to bring these factions together. So people have asked me a lot of questions about demographics. The people that spoke to me did so often under a kind of context of anonymity, so I don't have demographic information, but that's sort of the politics behind it.
But there's no Antifa group,
The closest there is in the U.S. is there's something called the Torch Network, T-O-R-C-H, which is a network of about 12 to 14 groups that share resources, meet annually, but there is no sort of central command. All right, lots of hands. I probably won't get to everyone, but let's go in the front. Yes.
So the nonviolent movement that we think of, I don't know about Europe, but in the United States,
Sure.
That has a lot of cachet with those of us who admired Martin Luther King
Sure.
and that whole movement. So in your experience and
Sure.
research, is this letting go of nonviolence and being willing to be violent, is it as effective in the end, or how do you discipline the violence in the way that he disciplined the nonviolence?
Great question, great question. To clarify, I think that the vast majority of circumstances and movements in politics ought to be done nonviolently, and it's almost always the most effective method. So just get that out of the way. Whenever I think of the question of fascism and anti-fascism, I think it's important to start with the most egregious examples of what they've meant, which obviously is the Holocaust. So the question comes to me, would it have been possible to strictly nonviolently resist the Nazis? Some have made the argument that it could have been, that it was possible to some extent in Western Europe, and if you were a non-Jew in the Netherlands or France and you did a nonviolent civil disobedience, chances are you would not be killed, in part because Hitler considered those people to be actually human and wanted to pacify the population. If you were someone in Poland or Ukraine, pretty much no matter who you were, if you did some sort of nonviolent protest, we know how that would have ended up. So to me, I think what it shows is that the nonviolent movements we think of usually succeed to the degree to which they can leverage a certain cross-section of public opinion. And that kind of element of moral superiority is really central to what nonviolent organizing is about. In the context, of course, of the 30s and 40s in Eastern Europe, I don't think there was a cross-section of public opinion that could have been leveraged in the interest of stopping Hitler. That doesn't mean that you can simply transplant that case onto other cases, but I think for me that's a sort of an example of where I think self-defense was legitimate. Now let's fast forward to the 80s, 90s, to the present, and think of what is the experience, for example, if you live in a Turkish immigrant community in the late 80s in Berlin, and there are neo-Nazis attacking your family and friends in a context where most of society would rather you not be there. Or if you're part of a queer or trans community in Oklahoma today, and you've had run-ins with the local law enforcement, and there's a mayor of the town who thinks that you are all sinners, and there's a white supremacist group that's beating up your friends, what do you do? Is there a public opinion that could make it stop? So I'm just offering this as food for thought, that there are times when self-defense is legitimate. I believe that, you know, there are quotes from Gandhi and others that saying, it's better you must resist, ideally non-violently, but it's better to resist violently than not do anything at all. I have great respect for the history of nonviolent resistance. I'm not trying to pit this as a sort of argument or debate. I just think there are times when self-defense are legitimate, and I think that when dealing with the far right, it's lamentably necessary, because even if the vast majority of society agrees with your politics, you could still get killed. But that's just my take. You've been having your hand up for a while, yes.
Okay, you know, you bring up a couple of things. The right of me to say something, free speech in the United States, ends when I threaten you bodily. I believe that's kind of what the Supreme Court has said. But there's another kind of threat. I remember a Columbia professor giving a talk locally over here a few years ago, and she said that when you do functional MRIs, in other words, when you look at the brain, when someone is actually doing things, and you threaten them with words, or you hit them, it goes to the same site in the brain.
Okay.
So when we are threatened with words, sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never harm us. Words can feel the same as pain. And I think that's what's going on. Many of us have a lower tolerance to go to that pain center with words. And I think that may be part of what's going on. You actually hurt me when you said those things. You've taken away my dignity. And I think that's what we fight for, literally and figuratively.
Very good point that I agree with. And I think that gets to a larger discussion, which is not held often enough, which is that how we define violence and nonviolence is often very culturally and historically determined, which doesn't mean that those distinctions are unimportant, but they are very much up for conversation. And in some cases, words can have that effect. Yes?
That leads to the issue of social media, and
Yeah.
we didn't have that in the 30s. We did have a depression,
Yeah.
and so you had the people of Germany who turned out in favor of the socialists, what started as the socialists, because of the population and what was going on with them. And now we have a situation where we have ultra-conservatives with the president, and they're spreading the word with social media, which was much more effective at spreading it than it was before. And this is not an argument against using force, but it is a fact that we have much more danger now than we had at that time, and we have more people that are in favor of the ultra-right, maybe not as far as fascism, but getting on that border, and that's what we have to be careful of.
Yeah, right. So definitely the alt-right is a product of these social media environments, of tapping into the kinds of alienation that a lot of their target demographics feel. It's also helped organizing against them. It is a two-way street, although I think in general I'm on the more skeptical end, that I think a lot of these information technologies are often used for purposes of surveillance that forestall the potential of social transformation, but that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah, the role of communications technology has been central to all of this. You know, the role of radio and the newspaper has been well documented in the early part of the century. And a lot of the struggle has been waged on those fronts, pushing, like recently YouTube got rid of Alex Jones of InfoWars, got rid of his conspiracy theory broadcasts. There have been, especially after Charlottesville, pressures on web domains to take down neo-Nazi websites. So a lot of this, and recently I spoke with someone who was part of this, the Sleeping Giants project to get corporations to pull their money out of Breitbart, which was successful. So a lot of this happens at that level of you can deprive Nazis of a platform in a myriad of ways, and often that's the most effective is cutting off their ability to reach out to people, because if people don't find out about these ideas, that reduces the likelihood that they're going to embrace them. Exactly. All right, we have time for one more. I think you've been patient, so yeah, go ahead. You can have the last word.
So thanks very much. I'm really struck that you've been talking about all kinds of political ideas, and there are two words that you haven't used: Republican and Democratic. Do you have any comments about that?
Usually someone says that about Trump, because I often forget about Trump, but this time I was like, I got to mention Trump. Republican and Democrat, yeah. Well, I think that what's been interesting about what's been going on has been what's been going on at what are normally thought of as the margins of the two parties. In terms of focusing on the right, certainly there has been sort of what you might call an insurgency within the Republican Party about trying to shift to a farther right direction, obviously, most obviously embodied in Trump. I think that it has a lot to do with Republican politics, but being that I'm trying to take a sort of bigger picture, it's not really about the Republican Party per se. If for whatever reason the Republican Party fell apart, which would be fine by me, there would be another party to pick up those politics and values, as long as there are sections of the population that hold them and embrace them. And I'm not trying to conflate your average Republican voter with someone who's part of the Patriot Front or the National Socialist Movement. Democrats, the far right often argues that Antifa is like the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party, which is just really silly. But that's been the playbook of the far right as it pertains to the Democratic Party, is take Occupy, take Black Lives Matter, take Antifa, take Standing Rock, take any of these things and say, you see, this left-wing movement is exactly like what Nancy Pelosi would advocate, which isn't true. So I get too many weird far-right memes in my mentions on Twitter, but that's where I'm going with that. I don't know what else to say, but you're right, that is an interesting observation. So great, okay. Thank you, everyone, great conversation.